Hello again, everybody. This is Steve Callis, the sports editor of WestchesterCountyPost.com, and I'm here with Janelle Albritton, the publisher of WestchesterCountyPost.com, and also a woman with a Master of Public Health degree. And we're here to talk about Rob Manfred, the Commissioner of Baseball's appearance on CNN 2 nights ago with Dr. Sanjay Gupta and Anderson Cooper, and it was all about how baseball is going to be returned, hopefully by July 4th, according to the Commissioner of Baseball. And he was talking in detail about testing, which has been the big issue in this country on all levels, but the testing for Major League Baseball players so they can come back and play baseball beginning July 4th. So Janelle, I want to turn it over to you because the questions that Dr. Gupta asked Mr. Manfred were answered by him, and I'd rather defer to your expertise in terms of his responses.
Well, as you know, when we were researching this yesterday, I watched the video a few times because I didn't really understand what Mr. Manfred was saying. I understood his English words, but I didn't really understand the meaning of it. And after watching the video 3 or 4 times, I'm still not really sure what he said that was of any help. And certainly that would be of any useful information or comforting information for the players and their families and friends. So the best I could do really would be to play it. Do you want to play it now?
So we're going to focus on 2 questions that Dr. Sanjay Gupta asked Rob Manfred, the Commissioner of Baseball, relating to testing, and Janelle is going to play the actual question and answer. This is Thursday night, 2 nights ago.
If someone does test positive for the virus during the season, then how do you handle that? Does everyone that the person's been in contact with then have to go into quarantine for 14 days?
Our experts are advising us that we don't need a 14-day quarantine. What we will do is the positive individual will be removed from the rest of the group. There will be a quarantine arrangement in each facility and in each city. And then we'll do contact tracing for the individuals that we believe there was contact with, and we will do point-of-care testing for those individuals to minimize the likelihood that there's been a spread.
So Janelle, give us your thoughts on that question and answer, because it certainly seems to be not what I've learned. You're the expert on the possible 14-day quarantine.
All right, so I've heard it 5. I still want to play it again, but I won't. So, but you have it scripted out, right? So the actual question was, if someone, meaning a player, I assume, or anyone on the team, right? If someone does test positive for the virus during the season, then how do you handle that? Does everyone in that the person's been in contact with then have to go into quarantine for 14 days? Basically, the answer is no. He could have just said no, right? But instead, he gave this, what I call syllable soup. Our experts are advising us that we don't need a 14-day quarantine. Okay, so who are these experts that say they don't need a 14-day quarantine? Everyone is saying the quarantine period is at least 14 days. I'm just gonna, just kind of as a sidebar, this virus is quite different, and it's very interesting. They're tracking the effects and the symptoms of it. You can be infectious and asymptomatic for weeks. So may I remind you, if you've seen the movie or read the book and the band played on, the epidemiologists, the guys who were doing the contact tracing, is basically what they were doing. They were talking to people in the hospital who had AIDS, who were dying of AIDS, and said, now who have you been in contact with, and going to track them down. And everyone, almost everyone they spoke to, mentioned this one flight attendant who was flying from New York to San Francisco. That was his regular job. And as it turns out, and it really exploded their brains, because when they were doing contact tracing before for sexually transmitted infections like herpes or gonorrhea, right? Which gonorrhea could be solved with an antibiotic shot, right? No problem. Like the easiest thing to fix. They would track them down, make sure they got treatment, and the problem would just go away. But this HIV/AIDS thing was different because these contact tracers found themselves in a subculture that had a lifestyle completely separate from anything that they had ever known, i.e. the bathhouses, unprotected sex, and a lot of unprotected sex. We're talking, some folks were reporting that they would have hundreds or even over 1,000 sexual partners per year. And so when they said, well, can we do contact tracing? Do you have their name and phone number? And the answer was a laugh and said, I don't even remember their faces. Okay, so they realized they were in a different planet when it came to contact tracing, and so they weren't able to do it. But the point I'm making is that this one man who was infected, who for years, we don't know how many years, he was flying back and forth, going to the bathhouses in both New York and San Francisco, having unprotected sex with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of partners. And he never, even when they finally tracked him down, after hundreds of, thousands of people had died, not hundreds of thousands, thousands of people, gay men namely, had died. By the time they got to this guy, he was perfectly healthy and well and not having any symptoms at all, still, years later. So let us use that as a cautionary tale, because with COVID, you can be infectious, you can be infected and have a viral load so that you're shedding the virus, but you're asymptomatic and you're infecting other people along the way. So keep that in mind. In Korea, they're doing a much better job, and the only reason I can say this is, number one, they're doing a lot of testing. So if you don't do testing, you don't have a case, officially. You've got to test to have cases. Trump understands this very well, and he said as much. But the difference between Korea and the U.S. is that Korea it has a very, one of the highest rates per capita of testing in that country. I get it that they're a smaller country. I understand that. But they're also very, very high density population, very high risk of spread. And so Steve's going to share with us what they're doing in Korea to have the low numbers that they can rightfully brag about.
And this is to give you an apples-to-apples comparison. Many of you, if you've been watching ESPN, you know they show Korean baseball organization games at 5 in the morning. I'm sure some of you are watching. But this is from an article in the Washington Post last week about what happens if somebody tests positive in the Korean baseball organization. Quote, this is from a Washington Post article, if any member of a team tests positive for the coronavirus this season, the league will be shut down for at least 3 weeks. And I also want to give you, similarly, the Korean Soccer League just opened, and I want to give you a quote as to what they're doing, and then you can compare it, or Janelle can compare it to what baseball is doing. In the K-League, which is the Korean Soccer League, a positive COVID-19 test of a player or a coach would cause the affected team and its previous opponent to be barred from playing a game for 2 weeks. Any game scheduled during that time would be postponed. So, aside from all the great things we've heard about South Korea with their testing, as Janelle was talking about, they really are playing it safe if even one baseball player gets infected. And I'll go back to Janelle for further explanation. But they're doing much more, obviously, than what Rob Manfred was proposing on CNN the other night. Janelle?
So the rest of his answer to the first statement that we're looking at, starting with the first sentence that I already read. Our experts are advising us that we don't need a 14-day quarantine. What we will do is the positive individual will be removed from the rest of the group. There will be a quarantine arrangement in each facility and in each city, and then we'll do contact tracing with the individuals we believe there was contact with, and we will do point-of-care testing for those individuals to minimize the likelihood that there's been a spread. All right, so 2/3 of, it's a jumble. So first he's saying that we don't need a 14-day quarantine. Then he says they will remove the positive testing individual from the rest of the group. Well, that's what quarantine is. Quarantine arrangement, or just delete that sentence. It doesn't mean anything. But what I find is interesting, then we'll do contact tracing with the individuals we believe that there was contact with. That's not how you do contact tracing. You ask the person who tests positive, who have you been in contact with? Because there are going to be people that the contact tracer doesn't know about. So relying on the team management or the league to follow up on individuals that they believe that the positive testing individual had contact with, I don't think a contact tracing means what you think it means. Okay? And then point of care testing for the individuals to minimize the likelihood that there's been a spread. Right, so all of that really is what I think he's trying to say, just to be generous, is that, yeah, we'll quarantine the one guy, but we're not going to quarantine everyone automatically. We'll do the contact tracing, and then we'll take care of them to minimize the likelihood that there's been a spread. Well, the only way you can really minimize the likelihood of a spread is quarantine. So I don't really know what his answer is saying. Again, that's why I call it syllable salad, because it's not clear. The only thing that's clear to me is the alarming part, that they're saying our experts are saying this, and we're only going to do contact tracing with the individuals we believe there is contact with.
So in addition now, and we're not suggesting, or I'm not, I defer to the expert, that they shut down the league for 3 weeks with one positive. But everything we've heard in sports or outside of sports has been, if you're near someone who's had a positive test, you self-quarantine for 14 days. That's what we've asked in this country. And for baseball to come out and say that there are experts, without naming them, because I've watched a lot of this stuff, and again, we'll defer to Janelle Albritton, our expert.
No,
but
we'll refer to Anthony Fauci.
Well, or Anthony Fauci, even
or the
better.
CDC.
And nobody has said you don't have to quarantine for 14
Right.
days. Again, the person who's positive, Major League Baseball is going to take them away. But all these other people, they're the problem, because that's how you get a spread. And again, I'm not suggesting they shut down the league for 3 weeks, but there has to be something in between, like make all those guys, whoever they are, who are near the player. And let me just say one other thing. You may not know, but the rosters in baseball, well, you know, it's 25-man rosters. This season, it's been expanded to 30, and the teams are even going to have a 20-day, they call it a taxi squad. It's almost like football. And I thought, Janelle, that the purpose of that is you have 4 extra guys who are right there all the 5 extra guys who are there all the time. And then if you have to quarantine 4 or 5 or 6, 7 players, you can then draw from the 20-person taxi squad. And I think that's how they can not shut down the league for a few weeks, because they're literally going to have 50 players for a 9-player game. And that's twice as many players as they normally have on their roster. So it's almost contradicting to me, although it's clear that Rob Manfred wants it to be, we're only going to get rid of this one guy, and then we'll see what happens with the other guys, which again, going up to Tony Fauci, is unheard of in America in terms of dealing with this virus.
So how does that work? You've got these taxi squads.
Yes.
So if you've got taxi squad A, squad B, squad C.
One for each team. So there are 30 players on the roster for each baseball team for every game. And then every team will have an additional 20 guys, presumably right around. It's a 20-man taxi squad. So if they have to draw from that, they can draw from it quickly.
So, I understand. So if the second baseman on the original team roster isn't feeling so good, he's running a temperature, they pull him off, you're not going to get a test result for at least a few hours. If you're doing an antibody test, an ELISA takes at least a couple hours. If you're doing a virus test, you're lucky if it's 24 hours. So they pull him out of the game just to be sure. Then what? Do they switch the whole roster, or they just replace him?
Well, at the beginning, if he's the only one, they'll just replace him. The question is, why would it just be him?
You see the problem with that?
I do, and I hope everyone else does.
Right.
But the other thing I'll say is during the interview, Rob Manfred also said that they have a lab in Utah where they can send these things and guaranteed, and maybe you'll laugh at me, but guaranteed that it'll be a 24-hour turnaround. But I do think the problem, at least as I see it, is the second baseman tests positive for COVID, and then you're going to have to look at every person the second baseman was hanging out with, not just on the baseball team, but of course if his family is there at back home,
family, friends,
if the guy who's in the ballpark who has to be, he has to water the field down, so it could be a lot of people. He was really, I thought in that interview, trying to minimize it. And Dr. Gupta, and we're going to do another question. But he's
making it worse with an answer like this, Mr. Manfred. You're making it worse by treating a serious question that Dr. Gupta is asking and answering it in this fashion. So if he switches out that one player, now the other players might be infected,
right?
And you're putting in a player that might not be infected,
right? Who
now might be infected by the other ones.
Correct.
Or, back to what I was saying before, the player coming in could be infected but asymptomatic. Feeling fine, no fever, but still shedding the virus. So, all I can say, bottom line is, we'll see, right? So, I saw the Governor Kemp's statements when he was announcing his decision to open Georgia. He was talking about, we talked with our scientists, we were looking at the data, we're monitoring things. So when I saw him, give that interview, it made sense. I felt a little better about Georgia opening up, and I care very much about it. I've got friends and family there, a lot of friends and family in Georgia, and I care about every area in the world, but especially Georgia. Both my parents were born there, right? So, and I don't wish a hot spot breakout on anyone anywhere in the world. But at least Governor Kemp was saying hitting the key points, that this is the protocol that we're doing, and that was the standard protocol. And I do think we can open up faster in some places than others, as long as we're monitoring and testing along the way, which we haven't been, and we still are not doing.
So there was a second question immediately following this one, and these are really the two questions we want to focus on because they focus the most on what baseball is going to do with respect to testing. I thought Dr. Gupta was trying to give Rob Manfred a way out, but Janelle will play the question and answer, and then she'll talk some more about Rob Manfred's response.
I guess the challenge, right, Commissioner, is then if you're trying to avoid a cluster of people becoming positive. That's what you're describing. But what if you do start to see more than one player or a few players, if they're still playing despite having been exposed to someone who has this, doesn't that carry significant risk?
Well, again, nothing is risk-free. In this undertaking, we're trying to mitigate that risk with the repeated point-of-care testing to make sure that people who have had contact have not been exposed, and by obviously removing those individuals that have a positive test, they will be quarantined until they have 2 negative tests over a 24-hour period.
So, yeah, Dr. Gupta really was being generous. He was really trying to help the commissioner look like he knew what he was talking about. And
from a medical perspective,
he's a classy guy that way. So, in other words, so in the first question he said, well, our experts are saying no, we don't need to quarantine. And so Dr. Gupta asked a follow-up question, and then Mr. Manfred said, yes, of course we're going to quarantine them. That's my summary.
Well, I think when he said when Dr. Gupta said, isn't that a significant risk? And you could tell right away at the beginning of the answer that Manfred kind of stuttered actually, and then gave you the old, there's risk everywhere, nothing is risk-free. I thought he was going to say you could step outside and get hit by a bus tomorrow, but he did not say that. But yes,
Yeah.
It sounded to me like some gobbledygook, because the basic question is the 14-day quarantine, not for the infected guy, but for everybody else that the infected guy was near. Even I know that kind of thing. Most Americans know that now, and you're supposed to quarantine for 14 days. I'm not sure how baseball gets around it, and if they do, as you said, I think that could pose a very big problem.
So, the beginning of Dr. Gupta's question was, I guess the challenge, right, Commissioner? Right?
Hint, hint.
Is then if you're trying to avoid a cluster of people becoming positive, because that's what you're describing. I mean, he was just being so kind and so generous. Like, this is kind of like you want to not have an epidemic in the baseball league, right, Commissioner? I mean, it was just very disappointing to see. I don't know why I'm disappointed. I shouldn't be disappointed, but I am. To see leadership fumbling like this, and not just coming straight out and saying, absolutely, the health of our athletes is number one. God forbid that any of them should die from this when it was preventable. We're doing everything we can to prevent it. And we're following best practices, all the guidelines. We're listening to the scientists. We're doing testing. Those are the talking points, even if it's not true, right? Just like those are the talking points that would give some kind of reassurance. But if he is speaking the truth, I'm not really sure what he's talking about. So I'll break down what he said phrase by phrase. Well, again, we're trying to. Nothing is risk-free in this undertaking.
He stuttered at the beginning. That was. He didn't know what to say.
Well, that was in response to Dr. Gupta saying, if you do start to see more than one player or a few players, and if they're still playing despite having been exposed to someone who has this, doesn't that carry significant risk?
Yes.
The answer is yes. The answer, just say yes. It's not that hard.
Well, the commissioner is not going to say yes. That's the problem.
But instead, he says, well, again, as if to say, as I've said previously, which is another way of saying, I'm going to repeat myself because apparently I wasn't clear the first time and or you weren't listening to me the first time. So I'm going to say it again, right? That's the polite way of, okay. Well, again, we're trying to, in other words, we're trying to
he was going to say something
prevent,
and then he stopped again.
Yeah, we're trying to, nothing is risk-free in this undertaking. So if please, people, please don't compare COVID deaths to car accidents and smoking-related deaths and other flu deaths. Okay, this is different. I get that it's the flu. My take-home message today would be that we don't need to be afraid of COVID. If we approach it properly, we can empower ourselves and get back to living, get back to going outside and meeting with our friends. The rules of social engagement are going to have to change, at least for a while. I've been doing research, and I've got a workshop. If you're interested in the workshop, you can email me, westchestercountypost@gmail.com. There are ways to beat this virus, and it's not that scary. You know, and as I've said in a thread on Facebook with some friends, COVID-19 is not Bird Box, all right? It's not like you look at someone who has it and you die. the COVID virus is not Tinkerbell. It doesn't just fly around by itself. It has to be encapsulated in moisture, an aerosol mist that can float around for minutes or hours. Yeah, but it's all about being in the mist, and that's why wearing a mask is helpful, because it will catch those droplets and absorb them in the fabric before they get into your respiratory system. Okay, so anyway, I digress. So I'm going to start back at the top of his second answer. Well, again, we're trying to. Nothing is risk-free in this undertaking. We're trying to mitigate that risk with the repeated point-of-care testing to make sure that people who have had contact have not been exposed, and by obviously removing those individuals that have a positive test. They will be quarantined until they have 2 negative tests over a 24-hour period.
And if I could ask Janelle, when he says to make sure they haven't been exposed, they've already been exposed just by being around the person who's infected.
Right.
That's why there's contact tracing.
Point of care testing to make sure that people who have had contact have not been exposed. So the chances are, if you've had contact with someone who's infected, if you've had contact with them, you've been exposed to them. It doesn't mean that you're infected.
Right.
And I think that may be what he was trying to say.
I think you're right.
He just doesn't have the right vocabulary. And he could have read a statement, like, you know, but it's just not, and I don't want to pick on him too much, but he's the commissioner of baseball, and it's his job to have the right words, to give clear answers, to give assurance, to give confidence to the fans that our athletes are protected, and their family, and their friends, and everyone who works in the organization. That there are best practices in place. We know what the best practices are. They've been developed over years of making mistakes. That's why they're called best practices. They're based on lessons learned, which is a nice way of saying mistakes.
And I will say, so the next day I read everything I could on this. I'm fortunate that I can call up an expert, an MPH, who knows about this stuff backwards and forwards.
Not a doctor, not an immunologist, but yeah.
An expert nonetheless, in terms of the knowledge she's just told you for the last whatever. But my problem was, as a baseball guy and a baseball writer, I thought I understood this was a problem. I don't think I understood the magnitude of the problem. And every article I read the next day, they just talked in generalizations. They even talked about these two questions in terms of the testing, and essentially it was all good. But then if you know about the Korean Baseball League, which some of you do, and the soccer league, and what they're doing, and then you compare it to what is being proposed. Now look, the players, my point is I never read any articles. I thought there'd be 10 articles the next day about what we've just talked about, and there weren't any. Now maybe there's been some since, because this is the second day, but my concern is that there wasn't like an outrage as to all of this, and maybe we'll get it from the players' union, because the players have not agreed.
Yeah, where's the outrage?
Well,
yeah, we're saying that a lot nowadays.
But it might be coming now from the players' union, because they have not agreed to this. They were giving an 80-page or 82-page just protocols,
right.
And this will be in there. But I don't know if it's going to be a needle in the haystack. Obviously, Tony Clark, the head of the Players Association, is a bright guy. I assume they'll have some lawyers, or preferably doctors, or people with a master's degree in public health.
What a concept.
Well, and all of you know,
some experts in the opinion.
all of you know about the money issues, so that's the other side of it, and that's a big issue as well. But I would think player safety has to be first, even above money. Maybe I'm wrong. But I do think this gives you at least a good explanation as to what's happening in South Korea, what's happening in America. We all want to see baseball, and hopefully it'll, come to fruition, maybe not by July 4th, I'm not sure. But there's going to have to be better rules than this, because I think Janelle essentially said, and I believe there's a much better chance of having another outbreak if you don't do something, not with the infected guy, he'll be taken out, but the guys that the infected guy has dealt with, and those are the people, as Janelle said, who could really spread the disease. Any final thoughts on this thing?
Look, time will tell. And as I said, I'm not wishing COVID on anyone, without exception. But when we don't follow best practices and when we're not careful, we are risking other people's lives. And so many of these deaths in this country, I believe, were preventable. And since the early March, when this really started to ramp up, and I was watching with alarm the lack of response from Trump's administration, I knew that there were going to be many more deaths than there would have been otherwise had the response been more carefully thought through and based on years of experience that had been built up around the world. So time will tell. We'll see. You know, I hope there's not another outbreak in Florida or Georgia or Michigan or Wisconsin. I hope that there's not that big second wave like there was in the 1918 flu epidemic, where 3 to 4 times more people died in the second wave than the first. I hope that doesn't happen this time. And if it does, we have no excuse. We've got better access to information. We've got better ability to share right information and to debunk wrong information. There's no reason that we should have a second wave in 2020. But I'm predicting rolling hotspots nationwide, worldwide, but especially in this country, because we seem to be the one who's handling it the most poorly when we have the most resources to handle it in the best way. So time will tell. Stay safe, my friends. So we have tools, we have ways. COVID is not Bird Box. You don't die when you just look at it. It's not an evil magic. We can beat this, but we've got to be smart about it. And I wish the best for all of the athletes in all the leagues and all of their family and all their friends and everyone in this country. May God bless America and heal this nation, and I hope that we will get past it. It's just a matter of time.
This is Steve Callis, sports editor of WestchesterCountyPost.com, along with the editor-publisher, Janelle Albritton, MPH. We'll see you the next time.